So welcome all. My name is Lisa Buffo. I am the founder and CEO of Cannabis Marketing Association. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We have a really amazing, exciting lineup of panelists. And just want to start with a few housekeeping items. So today we're going for the full hour. I'm based here in Denver, so it's about noon Mountain Time. So we're going to go until 1 Mountain Time, but whatever that hour is for you. We're going to do about 40 to 45 minutes of panel and discussion, and then we'll open it up to 10 minutes, 10 to 15 of Q&A. We love having an active and engaged chat, so feel free to talk with each other, comment in the chat. Definitely want to make sure this is beneficial to all of you as well. However, if you have specific questions, please use the Q&A feature. So that's on the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen. That way, Alana, when we get to the Q&A section, can handle your questions in order. And in addition to relevance, can't necessarily guarantee you will see it if it's in the chat, but we will do our best. So please put your questions in the Q&A. This is also being recorded. So if you have to hop off or you miss anything, we are going to edit this video and we'll email it out to everybody who registered for this event. So if you have colleagues who registered but can't make it live, we will send that video by the end of the week. We're also streaming live to Facebook. So if you want to join on social as well, please do so. And obviously you got a bunch of marketers on this call, so feel free to engage with us on social media. We have @Canbe, C-A-N, is it N-B-E, Alana?
C-A-N-N-B-E.
C-A-N-N-B-E, and then @Canna Marketing as well. Julia, Michael, you got any handles you want to throw out?
Michael?
Yeah, I'm representing the Canigma here. So that's at the Canigma, C-A-N-N-I-G-M-A.
By all means, go to theherbalverbalist.com.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to pass it back to Alana and then we'll jump right in.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks everyone so much for joining us here tonight. Really excited for this panel. I think, the reason I'm most excited about this is because it brings together two prime passions of mine, which is content and cannabis. So we're going to get into that. And I think really that's what brings all of us here on the panel together. And also everyone who's joined to listen is a passion for storytelling, whether that's as a means of entertainment, education, marketing, whatever it is. We really believe in the power of the story. And I think specifically in the cannabis field, all of us feel this obligation to help close the information gap that's been made from the past 100 years of prohibition. We won't go into that so much in this session. Anyway, before I let everyone else introduce themselves, as Lisa mentioned, I'm Alana. I'm the CEO of Canbe and the Canigma. Mike will tell you a little bit about himself in a second. He's the senior editor of that publication. And I think what this panel really excels in is putting all those pieces together, whether it's marketing, branding, educational content. And so we're going to have a chance to kind of dig into all of those. So without further ado, Julia, would you like to introduce yourself and just give a bit of a background in both content and cannabis?
Sure. My name is Julia Rubiner. I'm the herbal verbalist, and I am a brand consultant, a branding development consultant, and a cannabis content creator and copywriter. And I have a background in music industry publicity and reference publishing and journalism. And I am a longtime cannabis consumer, enthusiast for the plant. I guess it was about 2016, I was riding down the freeway here in LA, and I was listening to an interview on public radio with a cannabis chef who was cooking multi-course meals with all different strains and wine pairings. And I was going, oh my God, this is happening. This is happening. This is going to be legalized. I need to get involved. I have something to contribute. So I put the word out, and I was doing a lot of publicity writing, and a publicist friend said, I have some grower clients and they need some promotion, and they need bios and a company profile. And I jumped in and I was off to the races from them.
Great story. Thanks, Julia. Really excited to have you here.
Thank you.
Michael, what's your story?
So I come from a journalism background, spent about 10 years in very different kind of journalism, mostly political stuff. And my favorite parts of that work were basically twofold. One was my ability to call up interesting and smart people and ask them all the questions that I had on my mind. And the other is, breaking down complicated ideas into digestible, useful stories, or things that that people can actually use in their lives to either make better decisions or understand the world around them. And those are, luckily enough, the two things that I enjoy about working and doing the same work in the cannabis space. Been with the Canigma for a little over a year now, and since the beginning. And yeah, it's it's obviously not obviously, but it's a topic that I've had interest in for a long time, personally and professionally. But coming into it at this time where it's opening up to so many people around the world, not just in the United States, and also the massive scientific research and the volume of that research, and trying to translate all of that into things that that are useful to people, to regular people, is really exciting for me, and hopefully something we'll talk about.
Yeah, definitely. Glad you're here with us. I should mention as well, Lisa was kind of running through the attendees here and noted that we're all around the world, and also here on the panel, we're coming to you from all around the world. So I'm in Israel, Julia and Lisa are in the US, as I mentioned, and Michael's coming to us from Greece. So we really have international representation here today. Lisa, do you want to share your background and story before we get started?
Yes, thank you. So my background is in working with startups, early stage startups. Before I was in cannabis, I actually worked with veterans and nonprofits, and then I got into tech startups. But definitely a marketer by trade, really love storytelling, communications. But I actually started CMA in 2016 when I was the chief marketing officer of a brand here in Colorado, and was trying to figure out and navigate, all the restrictions around marketing, and, everything I knew from my tech background, just did not apply in this space. So I started asking other marketing professionals and say, hey, Alana, you're the director of marketing for this brand. Can you talk about what this regulation actually means? Or, what did you do when your Instagram account got shut down? And really recognize the need for community around this profession, as well as the really exciting opportunity that marketing and communications professionals have to connect with the public around destigmatizing, rebranding, and changing the narrative around this space. So that was the inception of CMA. We're an international organization, but largely based in the US. So thank you to all of our members on this call today for showing up and listening to us speak again, and excited to connect with all of you as well.
Great. So let's dive right into it. I want to start talking about education to begin with in the cannabis space. I think we all agree that education is important, across the board, but specifically here when there is so much misinformation out there. How can storytelling help here?
Well, I'd be happy to jump in.
Yeah, great.
You kind of have two ends of the spectrum where you can, let's say you're a dispensary and you have a blog, which I do recommend, and you post a blog post, very personal, written by a writer who says, I remember the first time I went into a dispensary. Even though I'd been using cannabis for years, I felt like a complete geek. I had no idea. I was embarrassed. I was afraid to talk to the bud tenders. It was just really kind of a stressful situation for me. So if you read that, you go, oh, I'm not the only one. Maybe I can get in there and be brave. And you relate to that dispensary. You feel like, oh, they kind of get me. That's where I'm going to go. I'm going to go see those guys. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have, I did a piece for a dispensary called why cannabis works, an introduction to the endocannabinoid system, because people want to know what the science says, and you have to really do your research and distill it and make it easy to understand. And then that dispensary develops a relationship with the audience as an authority, as somebody who really knows what they're talking about. So it's about building trust. So when you tell a story, people relate and they look to you as their go-to.
I agree with everything Julia said. I would just add that I think, breaking stigmas is such a huge part of what needs to take place in the cannabis world. And it touches on every single aspect, from regulation and legalization to, just bringing in new people, be they medical or recreational, people who for, most of their lives have been told that the cannabis is either dangerous or illegal or bad or something you should hide, and bringing them in. And that's something that storytelling is really powerful in doing. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is, of course, first person stories. Like you mentioned, walking into a dispensary and not knowing what to do. That was my experience too. That was my first time going into a medical dispensary. My first experience going into a recreational dispensary was, I thought of all the people I know who had been arrested over the years, and like, wow, I'm in Beverly Hills in a, Apple store looking dispensary, and this is totally normal. But as I was saying, especially on the medical side, you have people for whom this plant can really help in ways that we're really only beginning to understand, and they don't want to use it because of the stigma surrounding it. And just telling stories, whether it's somebody that they know, we all know that, first person recommendations and word of mouth are the most powerful thing in marketing. But, real stories by real people can be just as powerful. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of right now. And as you were saying, breaking down the science is huge, especially in the medical side, where people want to know how it works. Especially, most people do this with when they're faced with a new medical situation. They spend hours and hours, if not days and weeks, researching everything there is about the condition and treatments and medications. And there's a lot of content out there about cannabis right now, but it's still in its infancy in that there's very few sort of authoritative places you can go and just trust the information. And I think a large part of that has to do with conflicting information that's out there. So there's a lot of work to do in that area, but it's some of the most important things that need to be done.
Yeah, and agree with everything you both said, but I think something I always keep in mind with storytelling is that, in cannabis, we need to define it a bit. And storytelling is really connecting people. It's creating a connection. It's creating an emotional bond or a shared experience that, sometimes feels harder and harder to have genuinely these days. And we're not just telling stories about cannabis, we are literally rewriting the narrative, because the story that's been told for 80 years plus has been a lie. And it's been told over and over and over again in these really deep, complex and nuanced ways that many people have registered as fact in their head, even though most of that information is incorrect and or twisted. So when we're talking about cannabis storytelling, I just think it's always important to kind of keep in mind that the goal is to really, create that connection, and to also recognize that we're rewriting a narrative. And so when we tell these stories, we often may be met with a bit of friction there, because we're asking people to challenge their beliefs, and not only their beliefs, but also, why do I believe this? Why was I lied to in my high school health class? Why did the government tell us this for so long? Or my parents and grandparents believe something. So just something to keep in mind when it comes to storytelling, that we're rewriting a narrative. It's a complex and nuanced issue, and we're really challenging beliefs, but you know, as a marketer and entrepreneur, I just find that so exciting and a really amazing opportunity and an honor that we all have.
Yeah, definitely. I really relate to that. I kind of often visualize it that we need to take our users or potential customers or readers or whoever it is that we're trying to connect with, we have to take them through some stages. And let's assume that they're starting from cannabis is evil. Often the first stage is to get them to cannabis can be useful for some people in some situations. And then if we can get to that stage, we can move up to cannabis is useful in small amounts in certain situations. And then we can, you know, and it's kind of like walking through until we can get to maybe a joint on the weekend is the same as a glass of wine on the weekend. But that's like a way away from that kind of initial starting point. So there's a lot of chapters in the story that we need to tell here. And like you said, Lisa, we're not starting from kind of an even ground as we would be with, you know, marketing various other products or kind of digging into the research behind various other treatments. Julia, I want to kind of direct the next question to you, even though I think everyone else will want to jump in as well. When we're looking specifically at cannabis branding, you gave the example before of a dispensary. And I know you've got experience on this also before working in the cannabis space. How is building a branding process for a cannabis brand the same as working with any other type of brand, and how is it different?
I think it's mostly the same, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the principles of branding and brand storytelling apply, which is you are looking to use some of the terminology of the industry, distill the essence of your brand, and then you are going to infuse all of your marketing materials with the distillate, basically. Mm-hmm. So that's key. And of course, it's always about making a connection with your audience, persuading people by allowing them to relate to you. That's very important. In some ways, it's like other quote unquote highly regulated industries. So you know, cigarettes or alcohol, this sort of thing, pharmaceuticals, you have to kind of be careful about what you say. You can't make claims as part of your story. You have to be careful about who you're telling the story to. If you're smart, you'll make your compliance with the regulations part of your story. So that's a little bit of a middle ground. I think one way in which it's really different, and this is such a fantastic opportunity we have, is what you're telling stories about. It's a brand new industry. So you're talking about stories people have not heard, which is an enormous privilege. And one that I'm super excited about is social equity. I still can't believe, despite all the you know, one step forward, two steps back hiccups in achieving social equity, it's a long road. The fact that it's even a thing in the cannabis industry is amazing to me. I mean, what other industry can you think of where social equity is a topic of conversation even? So yeah, I think it's mostly the same. And I think that the branding ethos that I have applied to other industries applies here. And some of the principles of copywriting and content creation apply. So it is mostly the same, but there are fun little differences that take special consideration, but are certainly surmountable.
Yeah, I would just to follow up to Julia's point, agree with all of that. And I definitely think the branding process is the same, and we can take a lot of best practices from consumer packaged goods as far as unique selling proposition, you know, having a coherent color scheme and making sure you have solid, thoughtful, targeted messaging that is thought through throughout all touch points of the brand. I think the main differences as far as cannabis goes are compliance first and foremost. We have very different regulations at the city, county, and state level as far as packaging and labeling, even fonts that can be used, what languages and required messaging has to be on products. So I think the amount of depth that marketers, branders, and storytellers need to know on the compliance side is more than a lot of other industries, but is on par with other highly regulated industries. And again, I just think the big difference is we are trying to convey, like I always think when it comes to marketing, what is your unique selling proposition? And there's so many when it comes to cannabis. If you just start to unpack the science of the plant and cannabinoids, that distilling that and conveying that is a really big ask. And to Alana's point of this long journey and really starting small, but it's not like consumer packaged goods where, you know, coffee or toilet paper, they're kind of single use items, and cannabis just is such a spectrum. So I think that is one of the challenges we as cannabis storytellers have, that, you know, again, it's a mountain to climb, but it's a fun one.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think also I'd kind of like piggyback on that challenge that you mentioned, Lisa, which is specifically in the digital space, where those restrictions are much more difficult to confine to the county or state or country level even. So we end up having a very low kind of common denominator, where oftentimes we're trying to market a product that we can't even talk about at all, which is, you know, another opportunity for creativity if we want to flip it that way. But it's, you know, it's a real challenge as writers that I think we've all come across. Yeah,
I mean, as a writer, I view these as problems to be solved with words, and that's true. The variety is incredible. I can't get over how many different kinds of clients that I've had. I keep thinking I will sort of find a little niche within the larger niche, but it's all over the place. And yeah, you keep coming up against these challenges that I try to solve with words.
It's our best tool. Mike, maybe you can speak a little bit to how this kind of manifests specifically when it comes to educational content.
Well, there's a few big challenges there. One, as you mentioned, Alana, you know, a lot of times you can't, especially in your first contact through the traditional channels that most marketing and advertising and mass communication go through these days, actually say what you're talking about. You know, you cannot put out paid promotions on most of the major platforms about a cannabis product. And the same extends to cannabis education. It's really, really difficult. It means that almost all reach and campaigns have to be organically based. You rely so much more on engagement from your target audience in order to reach more people. And it really puts us at such a disadvantage compared to pretty much every other industry I can think of. You know, maybe guns and tobacco are somewhere in there. And those are not, you know, comparable industries, you know. And it speaks to, again, the stigma that we're fighting against in order to just tell those stories in the first place. You know, as any editor or marketer knows, like if you don't get somebody to click on the headline or the picture, you're not telling that story. So, you know, as far as, you know, compliance feels almost like too abstract here. Like the biggest challenge that we face here is just getting to people. As far as education specifically and branding, you know, it's, on the one hand, the story is clear. You have this science, you have this understanding of what cannabis is and why it's not dangerous, why it can be helpful, all the ways that those things are true. And you know, there's some levels of personalization that you can do with that, either by speaking to specific segments like medical patients, specific types of medical patients, recreational users, and specific types of recreational users. But it really, it's about breaking down stigmas in science. And you know, I work a lot in the medical side of things, So you'll hear me speaking about that more. And there, I actually would say that one of the biggest challenges is that everybody's trying to tell the same story. And to actually make yourself stand out in that space requires a lot more creative branding, a lot more knowing exactly what you're trying to do and either why it's different from what your competitors are doing or why you're doing it differently. And you know, that's a pretty difficult proposition.
I want to jump in and respond to something that Michael said. A couple of things, actually. You can't overstate the challenges that cannabis marketers have faced and are facing. I will say one thing I love about CMA is the education of me about programmatic advertising, which I really didn't understand that much about, but it's ingenious and it's powered by AI. And it's about threading those needles. It's about threading those needles to getting to the audience with your stories. So that is something that I think is pretty new and pretty useful in terms of reaching who you want to reach. So all hope is not lost. The other thing is that what Lisa was saying, and Lisa said something to me once that it really has resonated with me. About consumer packaged goods. And this is about the education piece. She said, you know, when you go to the store, you see 10 brands of toilet paper and you have to kind of figure out which brand you want to buy. But for years, the message has been metaphorically, don't buy toilet paper. Toilet paper is bad for you. Don't buy it. So you're at a greater disadvantage, educationally speaking, when you walk into the marketplace. So yeah, I mean, to me, this is very well targeted, this discussion, because it's all marketing in cannabis right now. I think is all about education, because that mountain is so high to climb, like you guys have said.
Definitely. And I think, thank you for that, Julia. The big thing with storytelling in cannabis is where that friction I was talking about earlier and the don't buy cannabis thing is that we are bumping up against fear, and fear is immediately when people put up their walls and then they just stop listening and they can't hear and nothing is getting through. It's almost like that it's that thick cement wall, and creating that emotional connection through storytelling is what starts to bring that down little by little. And that's an immediate barrier that so many other spaces, and to Julia's point, industries just don't have. But storytelling is also a form of validation. And even if you don't, can't 100% put yourself in someone else's shoes, or maybe you never thought you could, but you heard a story and that underlying theme gets you into that place of empathy or gets you into that place of validating, I know what that's like, or I can imagine what that's like. That's a really important step that takes conscious thought, willingness to be vulnerable and authentic, willingness to share our own stories. And it's a repetitive, constant process that we have to do until that the story is no longer, it switches to that toilet paper analogy of just which brand do you want to buy, as opposed to, is this going to hurt you? So it's definitely a big jump we have to make, but Hollywood has known this forever. And they do a great job of storytelling, and it's our turn.
Just want to add one thing to what you were saying there, which is that I work, as I said, a lot in the medical space, and I've interviewed a lot of people working in medical cannabis. And one thing that I've noticed, is that everybody has a story about why they're in the industry. Everybody either was dealing with a medical issue themselves and found cannabis to be helpful or life-saving or life-changing, or they had a loved one, or they saw it up close and it created a passion for them, that they left whatever other industry they were in and dedicated their lives to this. And it's just, a testament again to the power of stories, and whether that's a story that you experience yourself or one that you witness or one that you hear, I think everybody has said here, it activates sort of an emotional engagement, which is really key, especially if you're going up against an emotional barrier, like being told that it's wrong or dangerous or bad. So yeah.
I think also that, we all tell stories to each other. We all listen to stories every day, all day. And I think that when you think about writing your own stories for your own marketing materials, there's nothing wrong with who, what, when, where, why, and how. If you feel a little overwhelmed by sort of sitting down to formally do that, take a page out of the journalist's book. There is a formula. You shouldn't be afraid to tell your story, even if you're not a writer, even if you're not a video producer. So I just want to kind of make that clear that there is a formula, as I said.
Yeah, definitely. I think what kind of strikes me from all of these comments is that we're really on the front lines here when it comes to telling your story, and we're not alone on the front lines. As Michael pointed out, there's patients and there's researchers and there's parents that are very much on the front line of kind of resculpting this narrative. But I know that I feel in my work that there's a real obligation here that we have in being the spokespeople as content creators and marketers in the cannabis space. And I'm interested to hear kind of how that sense of responsibility strikes each of you in your work. Lisa, do you want to start off on this one?
Yeah. So, I mean, to everyone's point, I have my own story with cannabis, and it's now sort of infected even those around me, those who were lukewarm about it or not about it have almost built their stories with me. I'm originally from Cleveland, like the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio. Ohio's generally, quite conservative in their thinking. And I've had so many of my friends and colleagues from growing up, oh, come visit Colorado. And the first thing they want to do is go to a dispensary. And I get to be there with them and have that moment with them. And that is so exciting to see my story then impact them to take this action and start to build their own. And I think when those moments happen, really honoring them and celebrating them is important. The other thing I want to mention too, when it comes to storytelling, is whose story isn't being told. And I remember when I took history in 5th grade, they always asked on the quiz, whose story isn't being told here? And in 5th grade history, it was, women, poor, and the enslaved. And we just, like, as students, that was just always the answer. But I think, and while we live in different times, the concept is still the same. Whereas as marketers and those who are, privileged and able to work in this space and be free and share my story, we also have to think about what stories aren't we hearing and seeing and why, and really take that into consideration when we have platforms to elevate the voices of others and when we have opportunities to just recognize that in whatever way is appropriate at any given time. But I do think owning our stories is one part of it, but also recognizing what stories aren't we hearing and why is part of the responsibility and the obligation that we have in moving the needle forward.
Yeah, and I think that this is, again, it's related to social equity aspects of the industry, and I agree completely. For myself, I'm so grateful to people like Michael who are doing incredible work to explain the science. I mean, my background, I said I worked in the music industry, I worked in publishing, I worked in journalism, but I'm not a tech writer. I'm not a science writer. I don't have a background in that. So I really, again, I rely on the kind of work that Michael and his colleagues are doing to educate myself and to be able to then convey that message. So my approach is to just do a ton of research. I tend to over research, I'm sure, and then cite my sources in everything that I do. Because I feel like it's my responsibility to get it right. And this is even, the other panelists know I have a bit of a hobby horse with this, but I have this thing, sometimes I will post, and I know this is kind of mean, but it's for the best. I will post errors that I see in the cannabis space, in cannabis media, in cannabis advertising, because you don't see that in other areas. You don't see typos in the promotional materials for Coke or Apple. You just don't. They're not there because they hire professionals to proofread their stuff. It's a value. It's an important value. It's part of the normalization of the industry. So I feel like this is also my responsibility. The thing I was going to say is I will post something and I will say, stamp out the stupid stoner stereotype. And yes, we all make mistakes, but I really think that we need to bend over backwards to not make mistakes, because the world is looking at us and we're not stupid stoners. We really have something important to say and we say it well. So it behooves us to make sure that that is what's going on.
So yeah, to jump onto something that you just mentioned, Julia, transparency, I think, is one of the biggest parts of sort of carrying that responsibility, because it's such a new thing for most people, because it's such a new industry, because there aren't standards that people know to look to in order to make decisions, whether it's about buying, comparing two brands, or comparing two different types of products. And for us in our work in the medical side of things, it's even more important because of the just sheer amount of disinformation out there, and coming from official sources. We're as you mentioned, Lisa, we're contending with nearly a century of government propaganda putting out patently false information on a scientific and academic and social standpoint, and we have to break through that, and the only way to do that in any way that has credibility, in any way that people can trust, is full transparency in your process and in your sources and in your information. And citations are a great place to do that. I think giving credit, it's the same thing almost, but giving credit to others who are doing similar work, and elevating other people in the space is a great way to do that as well. But just going back to the original question, the responsibility, it's huge. We have something that, it feels like so much momentum is going in our favor, but we're so much still at the starting point of what needs to happen, that we have to be getting it right now. In order to really bring people, governments, physicians is a huge one, on board and carry this forward to the point that it's not just the best industry it can be, but the positive force that it can be in people's lives around the world.
Yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
I was just going to jump in. I'm actually scrolling through to see if I can find the exact words, but I was looking at Marijuana Moment today and this morning, and I can't find it, but a highly placed politician in one of the states where there's a referendum, I want to say it was Montana, and it was the same old thing. It's going to be, massive car accidents at every intersection, and addiction is going to go through the roof, and your children are going to be taken away from you. Like the most antiquated kind of fear mongering from a state level, highly placed politician in 2020. It was just like, wow, that is just so blatant. And it makes me mad and makes me glad that I'm doing what I'm doing and I can try to counter that.
Yeah, it's an important role. So we're starting to end near the end of this section, and I want to just take a moment before we open up to questions from the audience. If any of the panelists have questions for other panelists.
Maybe
I mean, I would say, Alana, I would ask you, how do you, the coverage that you produce, the amount of content that you are able to produce, how do you do that? I can't imagine that you have a giant staff. I imagine it's because you are a very productive person and you are very organized. But, it's, you know, the internet can be like a gaping maw. And I'm wondering, you know, how do you keep filling it? What kind of hints do you have to just keep that productivity going?
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, first of all. I mean, the internet is brilliant, you know. I'm not saying that it's smoke and mirrors, that we don't actually have as much content as it looks like we have, but it's a matter of kind of mapping out to begin with all of the territory and then slowly filling in each different part of the territory, you know, understanding that we've got 1,000 different topics we want to cover. We can create 30 pieces of content this month. What's most important? What different channels are we targeting? Where do we see that there's a real gap in terms of quality information? Sometimes we'll choose not to necessarily, I don't know, we have, of course, covered the endocannabinoid system, but if there's a particular condition that no one's covering, we see that as an opportunity to jump in, both as an opportunity to drive traffic to the particular site, and also as an opportunity to answer questions that are being asked, but not necessarily being answered. So that's kind of one side of it. It's like, I mean, productivity is definitely in there, but also a very careful planning. And I think another side of it is really working out. I really believe in meeting people where they're at. And so some people learn by reading. I know for me, I'm always going to choose the written version of whatever piece of information it is, but other people need to see a video. Other people need to have a graphic representation of a concept before they're able to properly digest it and understand it. Some people, you know, prefer to listen, have more kind of passive means of content production. And so we produce a podcast. It's kind of just about connecting the pieces of information with different people and how they you know, prefer to consume their content and how they learn and internalize messages. So it's like some sort of matrix of all of that that just works. And I think what's super motivating for me, and I'm sure Michael will agree with this as well, is that I just don't see us running out of topics to cover for at least the next 5 years. And that, as like a content creator, is very comforting for me, you know, it's never, and sometimes even looking back to where we started a year ago wasn't that long ago. And I don't think I'm that much smarter now than I was a year ago. And yet I look back at how much I've learned from then, and we could almost start rewriting everything. We won't, but we could almost start rewriting from the beginning, because, you know, the industry is changing and our understanding is changing and different markets are opening up. So it's just really never ending, which, you know, as we keep saying, is such an opportunity.
It's a good way to look at it.
Cool. So let's jump straight to some questions that I can see you guys have already popped in the question and answer. If anyone else has anything else that they'd like to ask, now's the time. So I'm going to kind of put the first question. I think probably, Lisa, you're going to be the right person for this, but if anyone else wants to jump in. So Justin has asked, what are some of the better resources for cannabis marketing compliance on a state level?
Great question. And this teed up perfectly, but we actually, CMA are launching a resources section in our member portal where we actually have links to all the cannabis marketing compliance laws. So for our members, it would be a one-stop shop. And part of what we offer at the association is really those resources and community, so that if that link or content you need isn't right there at your thumbs, there are people that you can talk to and connect with. So shameless plug for us, but we literally have a list of these. Yeah, that's what I'll say.
Perfect. All right, Michael, I've got a question specifically for you from Jennifer. Do you feel that people are more accepting, medical or consumer, of a structured medical program or just the recreational markets? She says, I know that medical cannabis will never happen for some states unless it's more regulated, for example, not dispensed from a bud tender.
Sorry, the question is whether it's more, people are more accepting of it?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the answer is both, I think. It really depends on who somebody is and what they're looking for, what they're engaged with. if your doctor suggests that you try something out, I think you're a lot more likely to consider it seriously than if you get it basically from any other channel. If you if there's a structure in place for you to do that and have access to it in a orderly and easy way. And even in the easiest programs, it's still not treated like other medications. Insurance doesn't cover it. The doctor can't actually write a prescription, even in legal states. They don't tell you how much, like what product to take and how much, even in most cases. So there's still a long way to go in that regard, but having a medical program in place definitely is very useful for bringing people into the medical space. And I think it's totally clear that the revolution we've seen in the acceptance in the medical space has led to opening up the recreational space for a lot of people, a lot of jurisdictions. I mean, you just have to look at the progress and see how it's happened over the past 20 years since, or 25 years since medical became legal in California. Yeah, I mean, I can talk about my parents endlessly and the questions that I get from seeing articles in Forbes and the New York Times, and all of a sudden the questions that weren't even legitimate before are all of a sudden things that they're seeking out answers to, and breaking into that mainstream space, which comes through those structures, through the existing structures, be it regulation and access or information, I think is key.
Yeah, definitely. We have a question here, and then from Kyle, and then Tom has seconded the question. So we definitely need to ask this one, and I think I'm actually really interested to talk about this. So the question is, how often do analytics shift how you tell your story? This is something that we're involved with all the time. I live on analytics. And I think analytics do shift how we tell our story, but it's only an indicator. This is what we can get from what's happened in the past. And the analytics need to go, obviously, be coupled with editorial judgment, and also with a kind of marketing outlook. So analytics are in there, and I can give a couple of examples, but they're not, and I don't think they should be, the only tool that you're using to decide how to tell a story. So I can give some examples from the Canigma that we see that different format types or even different kind of presentations of scientific research seem to be very popular, and then we'll try and mimic that. So say we see that users seem to be interested in understanding how cannabis affects the liver, so we'll break it down and also look at how cannabis affects the lungs and how cannabis affects the immune system. But it's only an indicator. I don't think it can really be the beginning of I don't know, a full marketing campaign. It's only a piece of the puzzle. That's the way I see how analytics fit in. What about you, Julia?
Yeah, I think that I do feel like, in terms of when I've been doing blog strategy, I always say to my clients, what are you hearing from the users? Even if it's anecdotal, even if you're not looking at your Google Analytics, which you should be, but it's what are you hearing? What do people want to talk about? What do they want? What do they want to see? But at the same time, I appreciate what you're saying, because I like to look at this whole thing as the story of the brand or of the industry is like a layer cake, and everything, all these little components in there make up the larger story. So you're telling smaller stories, you're telling components of stories. So you need to be mindful of going beyond what the indicators are. It's a balancing act, I think.
Last thing I'll just add to that is I think when it comes to storytelling, authenticity is the name of the game. And I think analytics, can help guide as far as maybe channel or platform, and can kind of adjust those little tweaks. But I think wildly changing it or drastic changes, you need to be careful about regardless. Because if you're catering too much to thinking this is what they want to hear, you sometimes actually do lose that authenticity, and you can lose that that underlying message. And Alana said the word editorial judgment, and I think that's the perfect term here. Is you definitely have to exercise your judgment, but I ultimately always come back to authenticity is the name of the game. And if the whatever information you're looking at feels like it's getting you too far off of that core base, to always keep that in mind.
Yeah. Go ahead, Michael. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was originally going to say that anything I say is just going to be saying what all of you have already said in different words, but I'll actually do that because I think everything boils down to 2 points. That analytics can tell you where to meet your target audience, and it can tell you what's working and what's not. And beyond that, you have to put in the work.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question here from Susan, who is studying to be a cannabis wellness coach for people and pets. And I'll read out her question. I think you might all want to jump in here. I'm creating my website and was wanting to know if there's any specific wording I need to avoid. I've put a disclaimer that I'm not a doctor and my programs are based on my personal beliefs. I was also wanting to put charts and graphs on my blog, putting as much cannabis information into the universe as possible. Is that okay to do?
I can start. I don't know if you want to start, Julia, but I would definitely say, depending on where you are, read the regulations. Overdo it when it comes to compliance and claims. I can't stress that enough. Underdoing it as far as fact checking, research, citing, and being aware of where those boundaries are is what can ultimately really hurt you in the long run and hurt your credibility, which, is really hard to get back. But I think it's one of those things where you've got to play it safe and consult with professionals on that. But I would say overdo it as far as putting those disclaimers and being very clear, and stay away from health claims for sure.
And I'm a big fan of charts and graphs, as long as you have cited your sources as to where you're getting the information. I think that stuff's really interesting. And again, like Alana was saying before, that's how some people really learn, in that sort of schematic form. And another thing, there was a question about SEO at some point, but the more content you have on your site, the better it's going to be for your SEO. I'm not a big fan of content for content's sake, but I would say don't be afraid to put that stuff on there. If people don't want to look at it, they won't look at it, but I think it will serve you in a variety of ways. So I would say, yeah, if you have that and it's reputable and you have the sources, I would say include it.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you can get some SEO data that can indicate what kind of questions people are asking, because that's what it's all about. It's about answering questions. So if you have a good sense of in the space that you're looking to get into, and the audience that you're looking to connect to, if you have a good sense of what they're asking, then I think that's an indicator of what kind of educational content you should be getting up on your website. All right, I think we have time for one more question here before we wrap up. So Heidi has asked a question: where are people investing their funds to get their stories out? Lisa or Julia, you want to start off on this one?
No, Lisa, go ahead.
I think it's very brand specific and very target audience specific. And I think you first need to understand, and I know you know this, Heidi, but like what is your brand? Who is your audience? And making sure, to what Michael said earlier, you're meeting them where they are. If your audience is younger, then perhaps consider social media. I think it really depends on where they are as far as platforms. Because you could have the best, well-written, edited, fact-check story, but if you're posting it on a platform where your target audience is, it's, you're doing this. So I think it's really understanding. And, we actually get this question a lot at CMA. And one of the things I always encourage people to do is market research that is not on Google. So go find your target audience and call them and ask, or send them an email and ask. If it's, 22 to 25-year-olds, find your nieces and nephews and call them and ask. they will tell you, and to not overthink it in that sense. We ask our members all the time what they need by calling them or doing surveys, and that you'll get so much more information, and people are really willing to share when you can have an actual dialogue with them, as opposed to getting, kind of very like tactical with it. So just want to emphasize that.
Yeah, it's like real live analytics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I think we can fit in one more question here, actually, because I like the question. Erin has asked, what are your best SEO hacks?
Well, I mean, I would say in part, in terms of content, this sort of dovetails with my other platform that I'm always expounding, which is the more specific you are in your storytelling, the better. The more details, the more illustrations, the more examples, the more you can paint a picture, the better. And that will help you with your SEO as well, because you don't want to be using all the same SEO terms as everyone else in their stories. So you want to be strategic. You want to make sure they're hyper relevant. But if you dig down a little bit into your storytelling, you will come up with search terms that other people are not using.
Just quick follow up to that. There's plugins. So like we have a WordPress website, there's literally Yoast SEO. I mean, there's plugins that just walk you through it. So SEO can kind of be this big nebulous concept, but there's technology that will just take you through the steps and get you 80+% of the way there. So to, look into those tools, because they exist and can make something that is complex fairly straightforward.
This sort of ties into everything that we've spoken about, but it also applies to SEO, at least sometimes, which is how everything applies to SEO. And this is something I learned in my journalism career. I wish I could remember who told it to me or where I read it, but lean into the obvious. Sometimes you're so sometimes you just so you assume that people aren't asking the more basic question, that you're focused on the system, and it's more important to explain each element. And in an SEO, that can go a long way, because maybe nobody else bothered to explain the most simple concepts, and it can help you gain credibility, both with Google and your readers, but also just find little areas that you can thrive in as far as SEO goes.
Yeah, I really connect to that. I remember that, at the beginning of my career in kind of digital content creation, which also started in journalism, SEO was kind of a dirty word. It was the enemy. It was like, we're the content creators, and then there's SEO that's trying to make us put all of these evil keywords into our content that we don't want to put in there. And it was a clash. And I think what I've really learned through the years is, and this kind of connects with something I was saying before, is that search data is a window into the minds of the people that you want to connect with. And the more you can kind of check off those questions, perhaps with the obvious, like Mike was saying, the more credibility you're going to build, the more connection you're going to build with them. And then, it's a matter of whatever your goals are, whether your goals are to educate or to sell or to get a message across, it doesn't matter, because you're actually connecting with people exactly on the topic that they're interested in at that moment. So, yeah. All right. So I think that brings us to the end of this session, unless anyone had anything else to jump in on.
I do want to thank you, Alana, very much for moderating, and Lisa for inviting me, and Michael for being an excellent fellow panelist. Thank you for everybody for coming too.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for joining, and thanks everyone for joining, and everyone in the audience for joining us. If you want to get in touch, I put my LinkedIn details here. I'm sure you're all capable of searching on Google and finding us. Check out the Canigma as well. This is a lot of what Michael's been talking about today. And as Lisa said, there'll be an edited version recording of this whole session that'll go out to all of you and everyone who signed up by the end of the week, you said, right?
Yep. And feel free to connect with all the panelists on LinkedIn. Please let us know you attended this. We appreciate your feedback. Yeah, we'll send an email from CMA with the link. Yeah, and if you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. My email is lisa@marketingcannabis.org, and encourage all the marketers and communications professionals on the call to join Cannabis Marketing Association. I threw a discount code in the chat, and happy to expand on or answer any questions that if you feel they didn't get answered.
Fantastic. So we'll wrap up. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day or night or morning, wherever you are.
Bye, everybody.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.